The call came at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and I almost didn't pick up. I was sitting cross-legged on my apartment floor, surrounded by fabric samples and half-finished sketches, eating cold pad thai straight from the container. My phone buzzed against the hardwood, and when I saw it was my mother-in-law, I genuinely considered letting it go to voicemail. We weren't close. We had never been close. But something made me reach for it anyway. Claire. Her voice was tight, controlled. The way it always got when she wanted something, but didn't want to admit it. We need to talk about the house. I set down my fork. What about it? Your father-in-law and I have decided to move forward with the sale. The buyers want to close in 60 days. We thought you should know. The house she was referring to was the one my husband Daniel and I had been living in for 4 years. The one his parents owned, the one they had told us, repeatedly and in front of witnesses, would eventually be ours. The one I had repainted, renovated, and turned into something that actually felt like a home, largely with money from my own freelance income, while Daniel finished his MBA. 60 days, I repeated. That's right. We think it's for the best. A pause. For everyone. She hung up before I could say anything else. I sat there for a long time, staring at the fabric samples on the floor. I had been designing custom handbags and accessories for 3 years, selling through my own website, through a few boutiques in the city, building something quietly and steadily, while everyone around me treated it like a hobby. My mother-in-law called it my little craft business. My own mother called it sweet but not sustainable. Daniel called it impressive when he wanted to be kind, and impractical when he didn't. What none of them knew what I had told. Exactly one person was that, 6 months earlier, a luxury accessories company had reached out about acquiring my brand. We had been in quiet negotiations ever since. 3 weeks before my mother-in-law's phone call, I had signed the paperwork. I had just sold my little craft business for $2.8 million. The only person who knew was my sister-in-law, Reyna. Reyna was Daniel's younger sister, the one the family treated as an afterthought, too quiet, too bookish, too uninterested in the performance of success that the rest of them had turned into an Olympic sport. She had a steady job as a middle school art teacher and a small apartment she was genuinely proud of, and the family tolerated her the way you tolerate a guest who stays a little too long. Warmly enough on the surface, dismissively underneath. She had found out by accident. She'd been at my apartment helping me pack orders one afternoon when an email notification popped up on my open laptop, a message from my attorney with the subject line, "Final acquisition terms." She'd seen it before I could close the screen, and for a moment we'd just looked at each other. "Claire," she said slowly, "is that what I think it is?" I told her everything. The negotiations, the number, the non-disclosure agreement I'd signed that prevented me from telling anyone, including Daniel, until the deal closed. She had listened with her hands pressed over her mouth and tears in her eyes, and when I finished she'd grabbed both my hands and said, "You built that. You built every single bit of that yourself." She never told a soul. Daniel found out about the acquisition the same way everyone else did when the trade press picked up the story 2 weeks after closing. I'll never forget the look on his face when he walked into the kitchen holding his phone, the headline visible on the screen. He wasn't angry exactly. It was something more complicated than that. Something that looked a lot like the recalibration of a person who had fundamentally misunderstood his own life. "You sold it for almost $3 million, he said. 2.8, I said. "Yes. And you didn't tell me. I was under NDA. Claire." He set the phone on the counter. "We're married." There was a conversation we'd been not having for a long time, and this was the moment it finally arrived. About the 4 years I'd spent watching his family make decisions about our life without consulting me. About the house, about the timeline, about the casual and consistent way his mother spoke to me like I was a temporary arrangement, about the way Daniel had never once pushed back. I didn't yell. I was surprisingly calm. I told him that I had been waiting to see what he would do when things got hard, and that I had my answer. We separated 3 months later. It was mutual. in the way that things are mutual when both people know the truth but only one of them is willing to say it first. Here is what happened in those 3 months, though, because this is the part that matters. When the news broke, my mother-in-law called me within the hour. The tightness in her voice was entirely gone. She was warm in a way she had never once been in 4 years of Sunday dinners and holidays, and carefully navigated conversations. "Claire, sweetheart, we had no idea. We're just so proud of what you've accomplished." A breath. "And of course, the situation with the house, we've been talking, and we think we were too hasty. There's no reason you and Daniel can't." "I appreciate the call," I said. "I'll be in touch." My own mother called 20 minutes later. She had been the one, 3 years ago, who'd sat across from me at her kitchen table and said, with genuine love and genuine condescension, "Honey, at some point you're going to need a real income. You can't sell purses forever." Now she wanted to take me to lunch. She wanted to introduce me to her friend's son who worked in finance. She wanted to tell me, repeatedly, how she'd always believed in me. I let her talk. My sister, who had spent years borrowing money from me with promises she reliably forgot, called to say she was so excited and that we should reconnect. She had not called me on my birthday the previous year. I listened to all of it. I took notes, not literal ones, but the kind you take in your body, the kind that settles somewhere between your ribs and don't leave. And then I called Reyna. She picked up on the second ring. "I saw the article," she said. "Are you okay?" "I'm better than okay," I said. "I need to ask you something." What I asked her was this. She had mentioned, months ago, that the school where she taught had frozen salaries for the 3rd year in a row, that the classroom supply budget had been cut again, that she was considering a second job waitressing on weekends, which broke my heart a little because I knew how much her weekends meant to her. That was when she painted, when she breathed, when she was most herself. I asked her if she would let me help. There was a long silence. "Claire, I don't want your money." "I know. That's not what I'm offering. What I was offering was this." I had purchased a 2-unit building, a small investment, something my attorney had suggested as a way to put part of the acquisition funds to work. The ground floor I planned to eventually use as a studio space. The upper unit was a 2-bedroom apartment with good light and a small balcony with a view of the park. I offered it to Reyna at a rent so far below market rate it was essentially symbolic. "You need to be somewhere that lets you paint," I told her. "That's not charity. That's me telling you that your work matters and you deserve a space to do it." She cried. I cried. We both pretended afterward that neither of us had. She moved in 6 weeks later. I helped her carry boxes up the stairs and we ordered pizza and sat on her new balcony and watched the sun go down over the park. And she said, "I keep waiting for someone to tell me I don't deserve this." "Nobody gets to decide that," I said. The family noticed, of course. His family, mine. They noticed that I was rebuilding quietly. And they noticed who I was rebuilding with. And more than one of them found ways to ask, delicately, about my plans. My mother-in-law mentioned that Daniel was struggling with the transition. My mother mentioned that family should come first. My sister mentioned, with a casualness that didn't quite land, that she'd been having a hard time financially. I want to be careful about how I describe what I did next, because I don't think it was revenge. I don't think I wanted anyone to suffer. What I wanted was clarity. The clean, uncomplicated clarity of relationships built on honesty rather than on what I could offer. So I became very, very boring. I stopped performing availability. When my mother-in-law called to tell me about Daniel's struggles, I listened politely and offered nothing. When my mother suggested lunch, I said I was busy and didn't elaborate. When my sister mentioned money, I said I was working with a financial advisor and keeping things simple for now. None of it was cruel. All of it was true. And the silence that followed the gradual stopping of calls from people who had always had so much to say was the quietest, most clarifying thing I had ever experienced. What filled the space instead was unexpected. Reyna had a friend, a woman named Sol, who ran a nonprofit connecting underserved students with creative mentorships. She introduced us over coffee one morning. And Sol described what she was trying to build a pipeline between kids who had talent and no resources, and professionals who had started in the same place. She was operating on grants that came and went, constantly one budget cycle away from cutting programs. I wrote her a check that afternoon, not a huge one enough to fund one full program year. But I also did something that felt more significant. I offered to mentor 3 of her students myself, to bring them into the process, to show them that the little craft business people dismissed could, in fact, become something real. It's been 14 months since the acquisition closed. I'm working on a new line, smaller, more personal, designed with input from 2 of Sol's students who have more raw instinct for proportion and color than most professionals I've met. The building is fully occupied. Reyna just sold her first painting through a gallery downtown. She texted me a photo of the little red "sold" sticker on the placard and then immediately called me, and we both screamed into our phones like teenagers. I don't talk to my mother-in-law. Not out of anger. I think I genuinely processed that one somewhere quiet, somewhere I'm not entirely sure I can point to on a map. We just don't have anything that needs saying. Daniel and I finalized our divorce amicably. He sent me a message afterward that simply said, "I should have paid attention sooner." I thanked him for saying it and meant it. I talk to my mother occasionally. She is trying, in her way. Old habits are stubborn, and sometimes she still can't help herself a comment about my choices, a suggestion framed as concern. But she catches herself more often than she used to, and sometimes she asks about the students I'm mentoring with something that sounds like actual interest. I'm patient with her. She's my mother. My sister and I are not in contact. That one took me longer to make peace with. I kept thinking there would be a conversation that fixed it, a moment of recognition that would make everything right. But some relationships are built so completely on an imbalance of giving that removing the imbalance is the same thing as removing the relationship. I had to grieve it like a loss, which it was. What I want to say, if there is a person reading this who is in the middle of something similar, who is watching themselves be underestimated by the people who are supposed to know them best, who is quietly building something that nobody around them can see yet, is this: keep going. Not for the satisfaction of being proven right. Not for the moment when everyone recalibrates and suddenly sees you clearly. Do it because the work is real, and it deserves to exist, and you are the only person who can make it. The people who show up at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, the ones who help you pack boxes, who ask if you're okay before they ask about the money, those people are not rare because they don't exist. They're rare because it takes time to learn how to recognize them. It takes clearing away everything else until you can finally see what was there all along. Reyna came over last Sunday. We painted my living room together, a deep terracotta color she picked out, which I initially thought was too bold and now cannot imagine the room without. We put on old music and made a mess and laughed about nothing in particular, the easy laughter of people who have figured out they don't have to earn each other. When she left, I stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the room, at the color she chose, at the life that looked, finally, like something I had actually built. The call that started all of this came at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. The life that answered it was already there. I just had to stop explaining myself long enough to live it.